Welcome to Haltech Elite NSP Training Part 42. This training tutorial, we're going to take a look at working with our transient fuel correction within our NSP software. Our transient correction allows us to account for variations in our throttle movement as we're driving around. So we have a little burst of airflow or a large burst of airflow relative to our throttle input. We're able to correct that in addition to where our fueling is coming from our main fuel table. We have a lot to cover. In order to understand how to work with this, let's jump in so we can check this out. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at working with our transient fueling for our engines using our Haltech Elite with our NSP software. Our transient fuel is something that we want to make sure is correct so we have good drivability out of our engine. If we didn't have transient fueling enabled, if we turned it off, disabled it, we would find that we would have momentary lean conditions or lean spikes as we're driving around giving throttle input. And that's because we can't properly characterize the burst of airflow entering the engine as we're giving throttle changes or throttle inputs as we're driving around. What we're going to find is that the main fuel table, whether it's going to be injection time based, fuel flow rate based, or if you're dealing with volumetric efficiency, that's our estimation of airflow, the main table here isn't going to be able to properly characterize the rate of change or those airflow bursts in our throttle movement. The main table here represents the steady state airflow as it's entering our engine. So the acceleration enrichment will be enhancing and adding additional fueling to our engine above and beyond what the pulse width, the base pulse width, is coming from our main table. And that again assumes that we have steady state operating conditions. So the transient fuel will add a percentage increase to the injector pulse width coming from the base values from here. So it's imperative that we've dialed in our main fuel table here, the main VE table, 100% before we even look at or worry about our transient fueling that we're going to talk about here in this tutorial. This is incredibly important. I see a lot of people have problems or struggle with their transient tuning because, again, their base table values here aren't properly dialed in. Now, what does it mean to have properly dialed in values? Well, that means as you're driving around, you've set your target air fuel, your target lambda in your table here. We have separate tutorials talking about that in depth. So you've set these already. Then your values in your table here, as you're driving around, you're taking a look at what your actual air fuel is doing, comparing it to your target, and they're pretty much on top of each other, pretty much on point. So there's no big, large deviations in those steady state type of conditions. So idle, part throttle cruise, even wide open throttle. Our throttle plate isn't moving in those situations. It's relatively fixed, and that's where the main table here comes into play, where we really can use that as our fueling delivery to our engine. But in the situations where, let's say we're at part throttle, we're at 5 or 10% throttle, all of a sudden you crack the throttle to 50%, 80% throttle, let's say you're going to try to accelerate real quick. That period of time between where the throttle goes from 5, 10% up to about 80%, that's going to be a transient event. We'll have that very large burst of airflow. The main table here can't properly characterize that momentary condition, that momentary burst of airflow, and the transient then will step in and it'll fill in the gap, so to speak. So the fueling delivery in that very short period of time is correct, and we have good throttle response and good drivability. Without the transient fueling, again, we'll have hesitation, it won't feel smooth, and the transient fueling is essentially needed for making sure your fueling delivery is going to be right in all conditions, and specifically in these transient conditions. So the one big takeaway from this beginning of the tutorial here is that the main table has to be 100% dialed in. I cannot stress that enough. If it isn't, you're not going to ever get your transient fueling right. Okay, so let's assume that we've dialed in our main fuel table, main VE table here 100%. And we're finding that as we're driving around that we feel hesitation, maybe it doesn't feel so smooth on the lower end as we're giving throttle input. What do? How do we dial in this transient fuel? Well, there's a few things that we need to talk about here before we start to jump in and talking about the actual tables that we have to work with here for the programming. It's actually really, really simple in terms of programming the values in here. But let's go into our main area and let's go into our navigation tree, and we'll go under fuel tuning and we'll move down here under transient throttle. And here, this is some of the background details we need to configure in order to enable and work with our transient fueling. So the first thing we have here is our load type. The load type is what we're designating as driving the acceleration fuel here, or the transient fueling. So this is going to be what it looks at in a rate of change in order to figure out how much fueling we need to add above and beyond the base values coming from our base fueling values, base pulse width coming from our main fuel table. So what we're gonna find here is that throttle position is the normal choice. You do have another option here of manifold pressure. I have literally never had to choose manifold pressure for any engine I've ever had to calibrate with a Haltech system. So I doubt you would really run into a situation where manifold pressure would be used. It is an option. Throttle position should be the choice or the parameter used for your load type. Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here. And you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.